Wondering how to make your paintings look more realistic? In this video, I'm going to share with you a tip on how you can instantly improve your artwork. So, how do you improve your painting? What I find makes the biggest impact is the contrast between the darkest shadows and the lightest highlights. Now, I hear a lot of people talk about the importance of making your shadows as dark as they have to be, but I don't hear a lot talking about leaving out the highlights, especially the really harsh ones. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So when your object is highlighted by the sun, like in an example of this female cardinal that I've painted, you can get some really harsh highlights, but it's what gives it a really interesting look and an almost transparent look. It's almost like you can see through the feathers. And I find that sometimes when people try to paint an object that is highlighted by the sun or a light source in this way, they are forgetting to leave out those highlights, or maybe they are just adding color onto it, and over time as they're progressing through their painting and adding more and more layers, those highlights actually get lost. And it loses that special something, that magic look that you can get if it was in real life. That's what makes a painting more interesting. And if you miss out on those things, it starts looking a little bit flat. So as I was painting this female cardinal, I identified straight away the areas where I needed to add the really dark shadows and the areas where I needed to leave out a very light color, especially in that highlighted area. And it was so tempting to add the color to it as I was working through it, so I had to constantly remind myself that this was the area I need to leave out as light as possible. Even if I just painted everything else and worked on that section last, just to make sure that I didn't overdo it and didn't get too far into the area with my other colors. Because when you look at an object with such highlights like this, the colors in that highlighted part are not even exactly the same as in the rest of the painting, just because the light reflects slightly differently and it's much brighter. So those colors become much brighter and kind of more pure that you might find in the rest of the object as you're trying to match your colors. So for that section, I had to make sure that I left some areas very, very lightly painted and almost even not painted in some sections, and only add a few brush strokes of other colors where I could see them to indicate what it was, to indicate that it actually was a shape. And even those areas also where the sun glow kind of finishes, there are still some shadowed areas there too. So I need to be mindful of those sections, and I've painted them in that way. And in watercolor, it is extremely important to be mindful of those lighter areas as you're painting, because it's much easier to add more and more paint and more layers to darken something than it is to remove the color. If you have to remove the color, you can do it at the beginning when your paint is still wet, and you can take it off with a bit of a tissue or your wet paintbrush. But if your painting is already dry and you're adding more layers onto it, it becomes extremely difficult to try and remove the color. And that is why we need to identify those areas right at the beginning before you even start painting. Now, leaving out highlights on their own are not going to make your painting look suddenly realistic and lifelike. There's other elements that you need to be mindful of as well, and that is mostly a contrast between the very dark areas and those highlights. So you still need to work on your shadow areas and make sure that you intensify and build up the color there so that you create that contrast. And that contrast is exactly what makes your shape looks more 3D and realistic. So those two elements together is what will improve your painting. But in this video, as I mentioned, I specifically want to focus on the highlights because you need to keep them in mind right at the beginning. It's not something you can suddenly realize and identify halfway through the painting. If you're struggling to see where you need to make adjustments in your painting, leave me a comment with your question and I will try my best to help. So that's my tip for you for today. And if you want to see the full process of how I painted this female cardinal with the explanation of the steps that I have undertaken and the paints, the colors that I used, what paper I've used, and how I approach a painting like this, I will have that come up in the next week's video. So make sure that you subscribe to my channel, click that subscribe button below, and you will get notified once the video comes out. And if you want to see more tips and helpful information on watercolor painting, I will leave you with a playlist that you can check out, and I will see you there.